welcome to Life in Focus with me, your host, Stephen Akinsanya. On this week's show, I want to talk to you about a very important subject, the law of joint enterprise. I was first aware of joint enterprise as a very junior barrister, and I remember being at the Central Criminal Court on another case, and I was aware down in the cells of groups of young men, predominantly young black men, and I say men, but they were really boys, being led to different courts within that building. And I thought to myself, how is it that so many young men are all involved in one murder case in the various courts? 8, groups of 8, groups of 6, groups of 9. Why are they all charged with murder? Surely all of them couldn't have been responsible for inflicting a fatal wound. This was when I was very, very junior. And then my exposure in such cases involving joint enterprise made me very aware of how that law has been applied in cases of homicide. And I followed the development of joint enterprise ever since, right up to 2016, when a case called the Crown and Joggie was supposed to change the way in which cases are prosecuted. Even the Supreme Court said there had been a wrong turn in the law. On the 2nd of February, there's going to be a very important debate in the House of Commons, a bill that's going to be introduced by Kim Johnson MP. And it's a really important piece of legislation potentially being debated for a change in the law, a change which reflects the true position of joint enterprise and how it should be applied. Because at the moment, many young men, predominantly black men, are being incarcerated for very long periods of time under this piece of legislation. So on this show, I want to discuss joint enterprise with 4 very important contributors. I have Kim Johnson MP from Liverpool Riverside since 2019, who will be introducing this very important bill on the 2nd of February in the House of Commons. I also have Jan Cunliffe and Gloria Morrison, who are the founders of a pressure group, if you like, called Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association. Gloria has been on the show before. And I'm delighted to have all the way from Melbourne, Australia, Dr. Felicity Gerry, King's Counsel, who in fact was lead counsel in the case of the Crown and Joggie. So I'd like to welcome all of you to Life in Focus, my broadcast to the community on what is a very important subject. Can I start with you, Kim, if I may? This bill, it's a very important bill, and I'd like to, first of all, find out briefly what its objectives are and what led you to be involved in this campaign.
Firstly, Stephen, thank you for inviting me to speak on my bill this evening. And yes, my bill is going to be heard on the 2nd of February. It is a very short bill. It's making a change to the Accessories and Abettors Act of 1861, and it just puts in significant contribution. And I think you'll hear from some of the other people on the panel today what that actually means. And, you know, you talked about becoming aware of joint enterprise when you saw all those young men in prison and the police station. I became aware when I watched Jimmy McGovern's 2014 film, Common. And it was very much, you know, focusing on a miscarriage of justice, and and that's my starting point in terms of this bill. You know, I'm not a lawyer; I'm a backbench Labour MP, and what I want to do is to change the law. You know, I would like to see these changes taking place so that only those people who make a significant contribution are convicted, because at the moment what we're seeing is thousands of people in prison serving very long sentences for a crime that they did not commit. But that's not to say that they haven't committed a crime, but they haven't committed murder. And And it has been, and there continues to be, a miscarriage of justice. And it's not just about the miscarriage of justice, it's about the amount of funding and the amount of money that's going into incarcerating large numbers of young black men that unnecessarily, we have a prison system that's creaking under massive pressures at the moment, so a change in this law will have an impact in terms of the vast amount of money that this government are spending to incarcerate people, and it will look at, reducing the numbers in prison that shouldn't be there. So like the Post Office Horizon scandal, this is equally as important, if not more important, because we're talking about young people, the disproportionately higher numbers of young people that are being affected by joint enterprise prosecutions is astronomical, really, and you mentioned about your experiences of young black men. 16 times more likely they are to be prosecuted for joint enterprise. My bill is heard. It's second on the order paper next Friday, and sadly the government aren't supporting my bill. But we're going to campaign very strongly, and I just wanted to say a massive thanks to Jengba and Felicity for all of the support they've provided me in terms of pushing the bill in Parliament. We've had the likes of Keir Starmer saying that when he was head of the Director of Public Prosecutions, that it had gone as far as it could in the court. It was now down to Parliament, and that's why I'm going to do everything I can to try and get this pushed through Parliament. David Lammy, when he was the shadow minister, also gave promises to Jengba that Labour in power would change the law on Jengba, and that's a commitment that I would like to also give to the families, to the campaign group. It's something that needs to change. It's long overdue. 2016, we thought that things were going to turn around. The courts did say that had taken a wrong turn. It's now time to put things right. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you. Well, I remember appearing in a documentary with David Lammy. I think it was called Dangerous Liaisons or Associations. But I'm saddened to hear that not a lot has changed since then, and part of the momentum has been lost. But I want to bring in, if I may, thanks, Kim, for that. If I can bring in you, Felicity. I'm going to call you, do you want me to call you Doctor or just Felicity? What would you like me to call you?
Felicity's absolutely fine, thank you.
Felicity, thanks a lot. Look, Felicity, you were lead counsel in Joggie, and many people still don't understand joint enterprise. So as a legal concept, I wonder if you could just give me a brief overview about how long that law has been in existence, what it actually means, and what the current state of the law is in terms of its application.
All right, that's quite a lot to gallop through. I'll do my best.
Okay.
So joint enterprise is really about the law on complicity. So it's about when someone is complicit in someone else's crime. And we have various laws over the centuries to try and work out how we can safely identify those people who genuinely join in with someone else's crime. And it's been used across the Commonwealth, really, in a way that has contributed to the over-criminalisation and the over-incarceration, particularly of young people, particularly of young black people. And historically, you can see it being used as against poachers, working class, Irish, and now we have a significant problem with the incarceration of black people. So it's what we need to understand as quickly as I can is the problems with the law, and then the problems with the way in which the law is used. So I'll start with the first one.
Okay. Yeah.
Before the case of Joggie that I led, the law had taken that wrong turn that the Supreme Court identified. Now, that wrong turn was, instead of identifying those people who intend to join in with a crime, so do acts that demonstrate their intention to join in, the law had somehow, I won't go into the detail because we won't have time, slipped to foresight of the possibility that someone else would commit a crime. And if you think about that, it's always been about the mums for me, seeing their children wrongly convicted on a miscarriage of law. If you think about it for a moment, you could sit in your living room, foresee that your son would go out with the rugby team on a Friday night, that one of the rugby team might get into a fight. That doesn't make you complicit in that fight, and it doesn't make your son complicit in that fight. But the language of foresight widened the net of people who could be convicted. And if someone died, that meant that whole swathes of people were being convicted on a possibility of a crime of murder or manslaughter, but in relation to murder were then receiving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit, didn't intend to commit, only foresaw the possibility of. So to me, when I picked up the case of Jogi in 2011, it was pretty obvious that the law had gone wrong, and it took me 5 years to get there and the Supreme Court to agree with me, which is another very long story. And what the Supreme Court did was they said, no, we're only going to have a legal framework that can be used in relation to those people who intend to join in, intend to commit a group offence. So it was meant to make that improvement, narrow the net of people, make sure you're focusing on those people who intend to join in. Sadly, what the Supreme Court also said was all those people affected by that miscarriage of law will have to prove they're the subject of a substantial injustice. And the Court of Appeal then said it wasn't enough to say that you were wrongly imprisoned for life for a murder that you didn't do. So pretty much all of those people affected by that area of law, all those people in prison now who did not intend to join in, are all still in prison and haven't been allowed to get out. And that as a result of the way in which the Court of Appeal approached the question of substantial injustice. Yeah. I sort of went away and did a load of other cases and came back to this about 4 or 5 years later and realised that the case of Jogi in England and Wales hadn't had much of an impact at all, because essentially people were still being charged in this very broad approach. Everybody present, even those people who are not present, were still being charged. And we managed to identify the problem in a case called Fiaz that I did last year. My client was in a car around the corner, couldn't be a lookout. The others had gone into a premises to snatch some cannabis. There was an unexpected fight inside the premises, nowhere near my client, who's waiting outside. Now, you might argue that he was part of the plot to steal cannabis, but there was, in my opinion, no evidence that he made any contribution to the fight that took place inside the premises. And it was really unexpected that the deceased person, the victim, produced a baseball bat. He was a lovely young man. He was a talented musician. It was terrible that he died. No one expected him to produce a weapon. There was a fight between two other people and he tragically died. But my client sitting around the corner waiting in lockdown when a bunch of kids are all stealing cannabis from each other, it's very difficult to see what contribution he made at all to that killing inside by somebody else.
But Felicity, some may say, Felicity, well, that's no different from the situation where you've got the armed robber going into the bank with the sawn off and the driver around the corner who's part of the joint enterprise, and he's equally as culpable as the man who pulls the firearm or shoots the firearm and kills the security guard. That's the classic example that I was always giving.
Absolutely, and that's when we're not really thinking it through. If you think about the way the law works is you have acts which demonstrate an intention to assist or encourage. And then we have in law something called causation. Not that you cause the crime, but that in some way that you contribute or have a connection to a crime. Because the law on complicity, or joint enterprise as we're calling it, it requires a connection with the principal. It's what we call derivative. You have to join in with what the principal offender is doing. So you have to ask, what is the connection between that person and the person in the car? Well, a driver, you can see the connection, you can see the contribution. And if you said to a jury, did this person make a contribution or a significant contribution to the crime, by being the driver, it may well be that the jury would consider that that person has played a significant role. However, sitting and waiting might be different. And we have people at the scene of, for example, a violent disorder in a park that make no contribution whatsoever to the crime, and yet 10 or 11 of them are convicted of the crime. And we're not stopping to say to juries, well, let's have a look at, is this safe? A miscarriage of justice is about whether or not we've got safe convictions. And it isn't, because we're convicting people who make no contribution, no significant contribution to the crime, just sort of rounding everybody up and shoving them in prison. And it's a real conveyor belt is the language that's used. And as a lawyer, I think it's really important to have legal tests to make sure that the law is safe and we've not got a miscarriage of law creating a miscarriage of justice. And what you've got at the moment is the conviction of people who don't make a significant contribution to the crime. Maybe Mr. Fiaz's case is a difficult one to get your head around because people think, oh, car, everybody in the car must be involved. But that's not the test. Are they, in fact, doing acts that demonstrate an intention to assist and encourage and significantly contributing to the crime? And if not, they're serving life with minimum terms of between 25 and 35 years for something they didn't do and didn't make a contribution to.
Wow. So is the position now that we've moved from mere contemplation of something happening not being enough to actively assisting and encouraging?
Yeah, I think what the Court of Appeal have said is, oh, your contribution is implicit in the words assist or encourage. Now, when we had aid, abet, counsel and procure, they were defined and we had to look for particular ways that you join in. Now it's just implicit. And I don't think the law should work like that. And it doesn't in any other field of law. You have to have a specific element that is about your connection to the principal offender. So we've moved to a point where we've lost all causation, really, all connection, and we're convicting people who make no contribution and certainly no significant contribution to the crime on patterns of phone calls, not much more than being merely present. And that, I use those words carefully because weirdly, what the law says at the moment is if you're more than merely present, that could be enough for you to be convicted of murder. And that means nothing. It's not a legal test at all. It's frankly a bit of a nonsense and very, very cruel when you see how the law is used to prosecute large groups of young people who hang about in groups anyway, which is what young people do. So it's a really shocking state of affairs and extremely cruel. I would say particularly to the mums and the families of people who are seeing their children wrongly incarcerated. There are significant problems for women, for Black people, now for Asian people. It's a really shocking state of affairs, and it's a very expensive travesty of justice, in my opinion.
Thank you, Felicity. Can I bring in Gloria now? Gloria, look, you've been on the show before, and it's great to have you back. Tell me about the setting up of Jengba. You and Jan got together. Tell me what was the motive behind it, and why you are concerned. Why is this concern about the joint enterprise law?
Well, first of all, I want to apologise that we seem to have lost Jan. Her internet's been very bad today, but
that's okay.
Jan and I met in 2009 because her son had been convicted of a murder he didn't commit, and my son's best friend, who's a young Black man who's 19, was convicted of a murder he didn't commit. So we were both struggling to understand how you could be convicted of something as heinous as murder, as serious as murder, when you haven't actually committed the crime. So Panorama made a documentary called Lethal Enterprise, and they were trying to focus on Jordan's case, but the judge in Jordan's case had put a gagging order on the fact that he was blind. He was registered, but he wasn't registered blind, but he would have been clinically blind at the time of the murder of Gary Newlove. That he didn't see it, he didn't touch Gary Newlove, and my son was knocked unconscious on the floor. I call him my son now, so that's fine. I don't need to qualify that bit anymore. But he was the first person knocked out. He did the right thing. Was training to be a defending officer. He was a very intelligent man. But because they put a gagging order on Jordan's blindness, they couldn't say it on the BBC. So they were looking for another case. And when my boy went to prison, he was doing stuff about anti-knife crime from prison because he was training to be a youth offending officer. And the producer suggested Jan and I met. So when we met, we had a cup of tea in Leeds because there was an organisation called United Against Injustice. And when I heard her story about a 15-year-old blind boy going to prison for something he didn't contribute to at all, and I knew my son was innocent as well, we just both thought we need a campaign. Now, I think as a grassroots campaign, we had no idea what we were doing. Absolutely none, because you don't realise what you're taking on. And we didn't know the scale of the problem at that point. We just knew that our boys were innocent and we needed to do something. I'd set up a group in London called London Against Injustice, and there were more and more families coming, and they were all joint enterprise. So just kind of instinctively knew that it was racist because Ken was in the dock with 5 other black boys. So and it was wrong, you know, like what country locks up people for murder when they haven't actually murdered someone, even if, you know, what we're trying to get to the bottom of, if they've aided and abetted in some way, or if they've contributed anyway to the crime, but neither of them had. And that was in 2009 that we met. And then in 2000, that panorama went out, and a CEO of a company saw it and said he wanted to meet me because he knew I was supporting Ken's, and he didn't understand how someone was in prison. And this happens a lot. We've got a lot of prisoners who are in prison that fundamentally do not understand why they are there when they haven't actually committed the crime. So there you've got a serious problem that people are now not trusting our justice system because of leading to wrongful convictions, miscarriages of justice on such a huge scale, We're currently supporting 1,500 prisoners.
Wow.
We sued the CPS. Well, we didn't sue them. In fact, we judicially reviewed them because they didn't collect data on ethnicity, disability, whether gang nominal was used, and gender and age. They just don't collect. And it's been a major problem since we started the campaign that the MOJ have never collated any data. And when Keir Starmer was DPD, the Justice Select Committee said we need data, and he promised to do it, and it didn't happen. When we got to the Supreme Court, and that was years of campaigning, years of knocking on doors, going to see MPs, getting, you know, family support, going to prisons, getting an idea of how big a scale this problem was. But genuinely, I don't think because we've met so many prisoners and prisoners' families, we didn't you just get hardened to it and just meet another mum that's distraught. It's a bereavement. They're you know, the mental health of lots of the mums, and we've lost lots of mums. Lots of mums have died as well. One was buried in her Jenga bangles, Sue Smith, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. But when Felicity got to the Supreme Court, we intervened, which I didn't know what it meant then, but with Justice for Kids law. But we were accepted by the Supreme Court to intervene because of the campaign's work. I mean, we've been in front of the Justice Select Committee twice. We've done numerous talks, I've been on Radio 4 a few times. Jan's done a lot more media than me because she's better at it. And we got to intervene in the Supreme Court. And that was defined by the BBC as a moment of legal history. So, and I've heard that from prisoners who are now out, when that came out on the news, the wings were alight with, you know, expectation and joy. And finally, someone was going to listen to them. They had finally a voice that, you know, they were innocent people in prison serving mandatory life sentences. So it really felt like, you know, we got somewhere. And then when we took the first appeals back in 2018, R versus Johnson, and they were knocked back along with every other case, that they kind of cherry pick cases that were more, don't say gang related, but they, you know, they use the gang narrative a lot in joint enterprise. But there are a few in there that just clearly, you know, wrongful convictions.
Yeah.
But what they did with Johnson was just raise the bar even higher, that anyone who wanted to go back to the Court of Appeal, and I believe now that it was all kind of a bit of a setup, because if you get convicted of a murder and you haven't murdered anyone, you're going to try and appeal it, and your family are going to try and appeal it. So there were just too many cases going back to the Court of Appeal. So that's why they allowed R versus Joggi to be looked at in the Supreme Court. They got the question certified because they wanted to stop appeals coming to the Court of Appeal. That's not cynical, that's fact, you know. So and then as Felicity mentioned, nobody can prove that they suffered a substantial injustice. So since 2016, we've only had 2 acquittals. One was John Crilly, and another was a young boy who was autistic, 14 at the time. He spent 7 years in prison, or 9, and then his legal team used the autism, but they didn't push on the idea it was joint enterprise, because what the Court of Appeal are petrified is if they set precedents, they let an autistic boy go through, then there are hundreds and hundreds of
floodgates are open.
That's all they're scared about, is the floodgates. But really what they should be scared about is the rule of law, because our families now, and it trickles down to siblings, it trickles up to grandparents, especially because it targets the Black community so much, communities, because they're all over the country. But they can look back and when they were targeted for sus, or when they were over criminalized just because they were Black. So right now, I think our criminal justice system is in dire need of, like Felicity says, sorting out. Because when you tell people and they finally get it, and hopefully people get listening to this program, I go, what, you mean you can go to prison for life not having made a significant contribution? And I actually met him at an RMT, Black Members Union event, and this woman just walked up to the stall and she was asking really poignant questions. And I eventually said, could I ask you why you're so interested? And she said, because I've just become an MP and I'm really interested in this issue because it's affecting my constituents. Because, obviously Liverpool, Birmingham was really bad, Bradford, but now we're getting Northeast cases. We're getting, not necessarily, 10 white boys were convicted of a joint enterprise murder, where one of them, the only evidence you can see on CCD is sitting at a bus stop drinking a can of pop. He hasn't made any significant contribution to one boy stabbing another boy. So it's getting worse. It's not, Jogi didn't sort anything out. It's actually tried to stem the flow. And Lord Toulson said to me, I said, why did you bring in the significant contribution, not the significant contribution, the substantial injustice? And he said, because the commentators will say killers will be let loose. So,
well, I want to address that if I can, while we're bringing that up, and perhaps I'm going to ask Jan to deal with this, because you're going to have spectators, Jan, who say, how does one strike a balance between upholding the law and ensuring that miscarriages of justice are prevented? Because we live in a time now where people want to see the criminal justice system being tough on those who commit serious crime. And I know that there will be those who say, here we are, another group of bleeding heart liberals who are trying to ensure that guilty people go free. Just put it in perspective in terms of how you see it and the significance of joint enterprise and why this law must be changed, if you can.
Well, I think it's important to say that if we keep doing what we're doing, guilty people will go free. Because the way that joint enterprise is used right now, there are occasions when the guilty do go free, and someone else takes the rap for you. So as we stand, if you don't want the guilty to go free, well, joint enterprise allows that. But we should be living in a country that wants the rule of law to work in such a way that every single one of us is protected, so that I'm protected. I don't want to go to prison for someone else's crime. I don't want anyone else to do that. And I think the important thing that people need to realize is that just because you read something in a newspaper and the newspaper is telling you that these people are murderers and this is the crime they've committed and that they're a gang, it's not necessarily that. It's not what's played out in the courtroom. Sometimes in the courtroom will actually prove a person is innocent of murder but yet find them guilty, and that it shouldn't be like that. And that's why young people are going to prison now, and they don't understand why they're in prison, because the actual trial proves they didn't murder anyone but yet convicts them of murder. I mean, my son's case, he didn't even see what was happening in front of him, and yet he was convicted of murder and given a life sentence. And back in 2007, when his case was on trial, it became apparent and very, very clear in the courtroom that the victim had died because of one significant injury, and that was the words that the forensic police pathologist used, that Gary Newlove had died because of one significant injury that could have only been inflicted by one person, and that one person had confessed to his mother in the police station. So what was my son's significant contribution to Gary Newlove's death? Nothing at all. There was nothing at all. And even to this date, the victim's wife in our case, she clearly has no idea how the law works. She clearly has no idea what part my son or anyone else played, because on multiple occasions to the media, she says that his crime was to stand and watch. Something my son cannot do. He can't stand and watch. And to stand and watch, I mean, is that a crime? Is that where we're trying to say that your numbers at the scene, your presence at the scene, whether you're standing there or watching, or whether you're encouraging or assisting, still means that you have to go to prison for murder? The lines are so blurry, and it's so difficult to explain to people without them thinking that you're kind of making it up to some degree.
Yeah, and Jan, just for my viewers, I mean, we talk about the imposition of a life sentence. Are you able just to share with us the tariff that your son received?
Yeah, my son was 15 years old when he walked into the police station, and he was almost 30 years old when he came home. So he was given a minimum of 12 years. He served 12 years. COVID kicked in. He did almost 14 years. Wow. It's the hardest part of all was having him crying and being and not understanding how long 12 years was. It was almost as long as he's been alive.
Absolutely.
We've got young people now who are serving sentences, and they are longer than they've been alive. And they're so long that we started to feel a little bit fortunate.
Well,
which is ridiculous.
I can speak of a case that I was recently involved in, where a young man of 18 is now serving 34 years in prison. Thanks, Jan. Can I go back to you, Felicity? People talk about joint enterprise being a racist law, and I know that some people switch off when they hear that, but there are, as I understand it now, CPS figures from September 2023, which says that Black people are 16 times more likely to be prosecuted under the joint enterprise law than their white counterparts. Look, you and I have been involved in the law for a significant number of years. And as I say, my first concern came many years ago when I was at the Old Bailey, and I just saw groups of young Black men being led to various courts within that building. And I thought something's wrong. Can you say something about the disproportionate application of the joint enterprise law and your thoughts on it, if you're able to?
Yeah, again, it's a really long story, so I'll try and keep it short. I'm not very good at that because there's such a lot to say. But large groups of young Black people are rounded up and locked up, and often for periods of time much longer than they've been alive, and often with what Gloria mentioned is the gang narrative. Now, that's basically an assumption that groups of young Black people are in a gang. And sometimes it might be as a result of what songs they sing or what postcode they live in, and who they hang about with or who they might be related to. And it's, unfortunately, the law has developed to allow police officers to give evidence as ad hoc experts as to whether someone's in a gang or not. And unfortunately, judges have allowed songs and videos of young people singing rap music to be used to suggest that they're in a gang. It's not funny really, but I even argued this in the Court of Appeal when I said, look, nobody goes through the record collection of a domestic abuser and looks for Tom Jones's Delilah when he's singing about killing Delilah because she's unfaithful. But if you're a young Black person, they'll go through your music. In one case, the judge allowed evidence of my client's name that he used on his PlayStation. You know how you put in a name for yourself on your YouTube channel, for example. And when I put that name into lyrics.com, there were 150,000 lyrics. It was a perfectly acceptable thing. But what the courts are doing is focusing on culture and colour, and using the police to convict young people, and not listening to those young people or their families when someone says, no, I'm not in a gang. That there's no often in cases expert evidence is not called, and now we have some expert evidence on behalf of the defence. And I have been able recently to exclude some social media posts and so on, but it's essentially an assumption that if you're black, you're in a gang, when you're just a young person with a group of friends. And it's really, really cruel, because with a background of knee-jerk reaction by the media, or the way in which cases are opened by the prosecution, opened really high to make it sound like everyone's in a gang and everybody's guilty of murder, what's the jury supposed to do? Unless you explain things properly in accordance with safe legal frameworks, and unless you say, well, actually, people's culture is not admissible, you're not of a bad character because you're black and you hang around with a group of friends making rap videos, then again, the law is unsafe. The way in which we use the law on what's called bad character has caused this disproportionate effect. And we've seen it in America. We know there's massive over criminalization and over incarceration of black people. It's a very similar problem, that there's this assumption, one might say a colonial assumption, that all black people are somehow bad. And I don't think it's any coincidence that what you've got on this broadcast is women and a black person thinking, hang on a minute, the law is not working for me. It's not working for my family. And that's because it isn't a safe legal framework from any perspective. So look, dealing with the Bailey, the example that you give, I see all the time. And I usually use the phrase, downstairs is black and upstairs is white. And downstairs is where the cells are in the Old Bailey, in the Central Criminal Court. And sometimes they're walking past you in their school uniform, because that's the only smart clothes that they've got. Down in the cells, the prison staff know that they're dealing with sometimes really lovely young kids who are just scooped up and prosecuted in completely unsafe legal framework, where assumptions are made from their musical tastes, where they live, who they hang around with. And I think that's why the campaign group calls themselves Not Guilty by Association. It's a real concern, particularly for young black people, as to why it is that they're being targeted and grouped, and that their trial is essentially a lottery as to whether the jury will find them guilty or not.
Yeah. Thank you, Felicity. Well, look, I mean, I know that the follow-on show from this in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be talking about the gangs matrix. I'm going to be talking about music and culture. I'm a young, well, I'm not young now, but I was a young black man.
Younger than me.
Who grew up in South London listening to KRS-One and other rap artists. But rap and music has changed. And, you know, it's a whole new debate about what people are listening to and what they're singing about. But Kim, I'm really concerned that a lot of these young men are products of their social economic environment. So you will be in areas where young men are hanging out in certain areas where they live, and something happens, and as Felicity says, they then get scooped up. And so many people, although they're into singing certain lyrics or being involved in certain groups, they're not always in a gang, but they get scooped up by something happening in their vicinity, their area where they live. Is that something that you have experienced? And I want to know, again, also from you, your personal drive and commission commitment rather, to getting this bill heard.
And Stephen, I grew up in Liverpool in the 1970s, you know, when sus was rife, you know, our black community had very strained relations with the police. And you will know that our system are disproportionately impacted on our black communities, you know, pointed out in terms of in terms of what Felicity's just said. So as a young person, I fought Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher. I fought against the police. You will know that in 1981 we had some uprisings in our city because of the toxic relationship with the police. So challenging and fighting social injustice is in my DNA. It's in the DNA of my city. It's what we do. It's what we're about. Whether it's at Docker Street or Hillsborough. And so as an MP. Challenging social injustice and racism is something that is very, very important to me. We live in a racist society, and even though this government fails to acknowledge that, and the highly discredited, I believe, Sewell report, that underplayed racism. And I see it every single day. I sit on I used to sit on the Education Select Committee here in the House of Commons. I currently sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee. So I see, injustice and inequality every single day. And the past 14 years has made things very much more difficult for our Black communities. Austerity, COVID, cost of living crises, it will be Black people that are on the first list to lose their job, don't get job. We saw that during COVID, it was Black people that were dying in higher numbers because it was Black workers that were on the front face. So racism is a major problem. It's a major problem in our schools. Exclusion of young Black men is a problem, because what we see is the school to prison pipeline. We're seeing some of these young people being groomed by gangs into county lines, and that is a massive issue at the moment. Child sexual exploitation is a major issue, focusing on vulnerable young people, and poverty often is the definitive issue that impacts on our young people at the moment in these very disadvantaged communities. And targeting of young Black men and the police scooping them up is something that plays into Middle England, doesn't it? It plays into the electorate. You hear Tory politicians talking about our communities, talking about our young Black people, and it's always in a very negative narrative. And from my point of view, that needs to change. So people making these decisions, judges making these decisions, are very detached from reality. From my point of view. And when judges direct juries in terms of these cases, they're not taken on board, the stories and the issues that have been raised by Gloria Jan and Felicity on this session this evening. And I think that's why we're seeing greater numbers of people being prosecuted under joint enterprise. So as a Black working class MP from Liverpool, my passion is about challenging racism and challenging social injustice, and joint enterprise is a massive miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's no coincidence that my platform is called Life in Focus, because it dawned on me, having represented so many of these young men in cases involving joint enterprise, many of them are just involved in something at the wrong place at the wrong time, and in an instant their whole life is changed forever. And it's not just their lives. Often many of these young men are very bright individuals, given different social settings. Oh my gosh, I don't know where they would rise to. And that's part of the pain that I feel being involved in that environment. And that's why I've chosen to step out of my comfort zone, if you will, from just being a barrister defending, but trying to educate and inform young people about how this joint enterprise law can actually change not just your life, but your family's life. And Gloria, I want to ask you about the wider impact of joint enterprise, because I know that, look, to keep a prisoner annually is about £40,000. not to mention the strain that is on the prison population and the taxpayer. You have seen, I'm sure, Gloria, the heartbreak of many families who have been affected by joint enterprise. And I wonder if you could briefly just share with us some of the things that you have seen with this ripple effect of the misery of joint enterprise.
Well, I want to just go back to the court. I think what happens is you're guilty and you've got to prove you're innocent. So it's flipped, that idea that you're innocent to proven guilty, because you see a group of black kids in the dock or working class kids in the dock, and you bandy tropes like gangs, or they're all in it together. One judge said they find they speak to each other more than they speak to their fathers when I was in court. But the effect on families is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. It never leaves you. Jan and I used to talk every day, more or less, when we met each other, and the concern you have every day is, are they safe? How are they going to get on in prison? Especially very young children. I mean, we're supporting 2 12-year-olds that people will go, what? Like, if a 12-year-old has done something really heinous, then like that, then they need help. They need therapy. They need seriously psychological help, like they do in Norway, not like they do in this country, which is put them in a cage. The other thing that's really sad is that a lot of our prisoners tell us lots of young people in prison will go as young people in prison who don't have any support at all. Jenga is the only thing they have because their families abandon them, or they don't have any family in the first place, because the prisons care homes to that pipeline to prison is ongoing. The family that came to visit me today, I said, why do you think they're trying to get 8 people for a murder that clearly is one boy has done it? It's in a park. It's there were 80 kids, or a lot of kids, because it was a party in a park, but they cherry picked 8. And brilliant woman, she just said, well, is it about money? And years ago, when Jeremy Corbyn was appointed the Joint Enterprise Special Rapporteur on the Justice Select Committee, he said, look, I know it's a moral argument, but you really should look at the fiscal argument, because it's not 40,000, Stephen, it's a lot higher than that. Because when Jan's 2 boys were in prison, because they were in a secure unit, which is the one down from the YOIs, that was, I think, Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's £250,000 a year to keep it, a child in one of those settings, which are better than prisons. We don't deny that. They are better than prisons. But that's a huge amount of money of the taxpayers, which and the other thing that's really frightening right now is we're seeing people, because of the backlog in the courts, we're seeing young people who maybe, are losing university places. We've got lots of that, are losing college places, or losing their future because they're on remand. Now, that's another tactic, I believe, from the courts, because if you bring a boy from remand, from the cells that, may have support, so he might have something smart to wear, or he's just got the tracksuit bottom that he's given on the remand centre, there are also those kind of connotations that he's less than others, that, and they lose their places at university, that, people lose their homes. So many cases we've had when it has been an act of violence and 2 groups of people have had to move out of the area, move out of their communities, no support, move out of the cities. So it's devastating. It's devastating. And then the knock-on effect, I really think that's one of the most important one, is siblings, younger siblings have just grown up thinking that, that this our court system is fundamentally wrong. They would say, wow, and have no trust in it. And if you've got people like me and Jan who've, went into this thinking this has got to be an anomaly. This can't be that it's across the board that, they're using this. And to have us now as campaigners saying this is so bad that unless it's reformed, unless we get rid of joint enterprise in its current abuse, I don't say it's use, but it's abuse, because there are forms of joint enterprise we wouldn't have a problem with, the bank robber scenario being one. But just to lock up a group because you don't know who's actually done one, and even if you do know, the courts, the principal will say, yeah, it was me, it wasn't any of these, I don't even know any of these, and they still want to go for all 9. Then there's something fundamentally wrong with the CPS. Why do you want to get 9 when you're not stupid people? It's only been maybe 1, maybe 2 or 3 might have encouraged or assisted in some manner, But that's why the bill is so important. That's why we're so behind this bill. And we need everybody to contact their MPs and say, look, be there on the 2nd. Please support Kim's bill, because it has to stop. It has to stop. 13 years of campaigning and we haven't seen any change. It has to stop.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Gloria. Felicity, can I just bring you back in there on that one? Because obviously you were involved in Jogi. There were a lot of things said about the wrong turn in the law. Do you think that there has been a greater scrutiny by the CPS now in bringing these prosecutions? I mean, Gloria's just talked about, and I've seen this happen in cases where D1, defendant 1, or maybe defendants 1 and 2 say, look, we're guilty. And the Crown prosecution say, no, we're not prepared to accept those pleas alone unless everybody accepts their culpability. Do you think that there is greater scrutiny, or is it the reality that not much has really changed? She dropped off at that crucial moment. I'm sure she'll come back to us. Whilst we're waiting for Felicity to come back to us, Kim, I'm going to come back to you. With this bill, Kim, I mean, are you able to say why there is objection or why there's opposition by this current government with the bill that you propose?
I think a lot of it, Stephen, goes back to what we've alluded to throughout this broadcast, and it seems to be, being soft on crime, and opening the floodgates, and we know that the time for the Tories might be running short at the moment, with the possibility of a general election coming up, but we could be looking at greater opportunities if we have a new government, because as I mentioned earlier, both Keir Starmer and David Lammy gave promises and commitments, to both Jengba and generally, the Lammy's 2017 review and his recommendations supports changes in the law in terms of joint enterprise. And I think the bill being read on the 2nd of February gives us a great opportunity in terms of both raising the profile and raising awareness of joint enterprise, because people's understanding is very unclear. And I think, the campaign that Jengba has been supporting with this bill is an opportunity, again, to clarify some of those points. And it's, and I think that that's very important, those messages that go out to say joint enterprise is about this. What I want to do is to make, a change in looking at the significant contribution. We've heard examples this evening of, people not playing a significant contribution and yet being given a 27+ year sentence for murder, manslaughter, a crime they did not commit, and I think it's unjust. It is a miscarriage of justice. And while the country have been up in arms in terms of the Post Office Horizon scandal, I think they equally should be up in arms in terms of, this is a greater scandal. It's about young people. It's about young people's lives being lost and the impact that has on the rest of their families. So it is really important to raise the profile, raise awareness, and clarify what joint enterprise is. And I will reiterate what Gloria said, people need to contact their MPs and ask them to support this bill, and get a momentum going, but if we don't get through on Friday, the campaign will continue until, we're in power.
As it should. Thanks, Kim. Jan, let me just ask you this. Doctor's come back. Felicity, before I come to you, Jan,
Hi. Yeah,
let's just get Felicity to answer that question. Look, Felicity, I'm really grateful. I know you're down under, and that these things can happen. Felicity, I think, do you remember the question that I asked you a moment ago?
Yeah, I think you wanted me to talk about the sort of same issue as to why we've got to where we are. And I had two examples that I wanted to give you to try and help people understand. So one young man that I represented in what was known as a joint enterprise murder. When you have to talk to young people, you might not have anything in common. I've been at the bar 30 years now, have to find ways to communicate. And he wanted to be a history teacher. My son's training to be a history teacher, and he really likes horrible histories. So you've got a young person who didn't kill anybody, is accused of being a party to something that was going on by going to a particular address. And you're downstairs talking to him about horrible histories. He had no clue why he was there or why he was charged. And in a different case, I was representing a 13-year-old autistic boy. And the prosecutor's closing speech was, in Manchester Crown Court, "Oh, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may not think you ever have the power to round up the scum of Liverpool from the streets of Manchester, but now's your chance."
Wow.
And I stood up and objected to the prosecution's speech, which I've never done before. We're supposed to be polite, but I couldn't sit through it. So really what we've got now is trials not on law, but on rhetoric, and trials where we ignore the person that we have in the dock. We put them behind glass, treat them as gangs or almost like animals in a cage. A lot of animalistic language about packs and hunting, which is really grim as well.
Yeah.
And actually, they're young people who like horrible histories. So I think we can all engage with that as people. And I just feel really sad myself that that we're having to still campaign. Jengba is such a fantastic organization. I have no idea how they've kept going, but it is because we have no safe legal frameworks to deal with those people who are accused of joining in with someone else's crime when they simply haven't. So I hope that answers the question. I didn't remember the question word for word, but I'm very glad that you let me back in to tell a few stories.
You're more than welcome, and thank you for coming back. I think part of the concern is that despite the change in the wrong turn in the law, whether CPS are actually taking time to look at the evidence before charging groups of 8 and 9 young men, and equally when the perpetrators are willing to put their hands up for what they've done, to still insist that the prosecution continues against those who are secondary parties where the evidence is thin, to say the least.
Yeah, I think there's a lack of decision making, isn't there? Let's just leave it all to the jury. It's a bit of a lottery without thinking, actually, we're supposed to be lawyers.
Yeah, well, I call it the Russian roulette. That's what I tell the youngsters. Jan, can I just ask you this? I mean, last week I was ridiculed for putting out a talk that I did to a group of young people on TikTok about the serious implications of joint enterprise and the kind of sentences that you could get in a real life case. And I was at pains to explain to the commentators that although I was addressing year 7 pupils, the reality is this joint enterprise law goes all the way down to 12, 13-year-olds and upwards, and that it was in their interest to be educated about it. Can you just, from your experience being involved in Jengba, can you use my platform to reiterate how easy it is to be involved in joint enterprise by virtue of not even being at the scene, but being at the end of a phone, or just being misdirected in terms of where you're told to go and stand in a video? That could be enough to get you on trial in a joint enterprise case.
Yeah, absolutely. And many, many years ago, Stephen, I called it a Russian roulette as well, because I sat in a courtroom and there were 5 defendants in my son's case, and the least culpable of all, I would have said, was my son Jordan, who was the one who was convicted. So it is Russian roulette. You don't have to play a part. And it doesn't matter how ridiculous and how little you have done and how much you don't know anything about it. You will go to prison, and you will go to prison for life. And I don't think there's any way that we can talk young people out of this either. And, you know, we could tell them to stay in the bedrooms and never leave the house, but they can still get convicted because if they've got a mobile phone and, you know, or a friend that they go to school with, they can still be convicted of murder because of a text or, you know, that association. So it's really, really difficult to tell young people how to protect themselves, and they can't protect themselves. And that's why Genba are now trying to do something with Kim's private members bill so that we can protect them and that the law protects them, because we've proven over the years that we can't help the people that we love, and we can't help the people that we have lost to prison. We've lost them, they're gone, you know, that their lives are over. But for me, you know, I can't get my son's life back, but how dare you do this to another mother? And that's where I stand right now. And it doesn't matter how many times you or I go into a school and tell a young person how awful joint enterprise is. It isn't going to save them. It isn't going to save them. The only thing that will save them is that if this bill comes through, that'll go some way. And I don't think it'll go enough of a way to save our young people, but it's a start. It's a start. And if the Conservative government are not interested, shame on them. Shame on them. You know, they won't fix anything. You know, the judiciary won't fix anything. And it's being left to a grassroots campaign. It's being left to mothers. It's being left to families that have been torn apart. And we won't stop. We won't stop.
Thank you.
Definitely
Thank you,
not.
Jan. Well, look, my time is up. It goes so quickly, and we could easily speak for another hour if it was possible. But I want to thank all of you for this very important discussion on joint enterprise. I firstly want to thank Kim Johnson. And Kim, I wish you all the best on the 2nd with that private members bill. I'll be looking eagerly to see the outcome of that. I also want to thank Jan Cunliffe and Gloria Morrison for their tireless work as part of Jangba, the founders of Jangba, and all that you've done over the last, I think, 13 years. I just want to encourage you to keep going, because these are young lives that are being ruined through this piece of legislation. And I also want to thank Dr. Felicity Gerry, KC, for joining us all the way from Australia. I know it's in the early hours of the morning, but I'm extremely grateful to you. And also for the work that you did in the case of Jogi, which put this case of joint enterprise back on the map. And I'm hoping that this time round, significant inroads can be made into changing this law to make it a fair and just law where the guilty are punished, but the innocent are not also punished, receiving life sentences. So I want to thank all of my contributors to Life in Focus, and I hope to see you all again. I just want to finish off with this. I have never left that feeling of being downstairs at the Old Bailey when I hugged a young man I represented who was charged with murder, who had been acquitted as part of a joint enterprise allegation. And it was touch and go as to whether or not he would be doing a life sentence. And fortunately, he ran the gauntlet of a criminal trial and played the game of Russian roulette and won. And my hope and prayer is that that will not be the experience of young people who are caught up with these allegations, who lose and end up receiving life sentences not just for themselves, but for their friends, their family, loved ones, and communities, because of a law which says if we are satisfied that you did something to assist and encourage, even on the thinnest of evidence, then we will put that before a court and let the jury decide. It really is a devastating piece of legislation that does need to be reviewed. And I hope that this significant contribution bill will be taken seriously. But in the meantime, I'm going to encourage all of those who have an active interest in changing this law to keep going, because justice has to be served, but also it has to be fair, because it could be any one of our children who get caught up in this piece of legislation. And that's why it's so important. So I want to thank you all for watching. I want to thank all of my contributors. You've been watching Life in Focus with me, your host, Stephen Akinsanya, barrister at law at 50 New Bridge Street Chambers. I'll see you next time. God bless. Thank you.